Morning, everyone. My name is Dan Larson. I'm a health and safety professional with the Pennsylvania OSHA Consultation Program. I want to welcome you today to the webinar and asbestos best practices and OSHA regulatory requirements. As I said, I'm part of the Pennsylvania OSHA Consultation Program, which is located at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And we're just really happy to have you here today joining us for the presentation. Going to talk to you obviously today about asbestos. What are the best practices? What are some of the OSHA regulations with general industry and construction? As we go along, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in the chat, send me a little message. I'll try to get that answered for you as soon as I can. You know, when we go out on visits to employers or to workplaces, different buildings, different places, sometimes we'll run into things like this, and we'll look maybe in a boiler room. We'll walk in, and on the left there, you see a large duct with insulation on it, or you have tile, like the right picture, 9x9 tile, and employers will say to us, well, what is it? And could that be asbestos? What are my obligations? Should I tell people? Just many questions. So the goal today is to kind of help you understand that, this is what asbestos is. These are some of the best practices maybe that you could have. And also what are some obligations you have as an employer? So let's start with a little background on asbestos. It's a naturally occurring group of minerals that can only be identified under a microscope. There are several different types of these minerals, and they are found to be very flexible and very fire resistant. If you go back far enough, you see writings from the Greeks and the Romans where they actually used asbestos, where they wove it into materials, and that were similar to cotton. Really wasn't in use in large portion until the late 1800s, when the extensive deposits were discovered in Canada. And once they were found, new uses started to be realized for this material. And it emerged as an insulating component in thermal insulation for boilers, pipes, and high temperature applications. There's three different types of asbestos, three major types of asbestos that you're going to see talked about the most. By far the most is chrysotile. This is often referred to as white asbestos and accounts for 95% of the asbestos found in buildings. The next type is called amosite, and that's often referred to as brown asbestos. As you might assume, its natural state is in brown, and it's often less than 5% of the time you run into amosite. And then there's chrysotile, which kind of has a blue texture to it, and that's less used, even less, and it's used in high temperature insulation applications. So why was asbestos used? Well, for many years, asbestos was considered a magic mineral because it kind of had a unique nature and widespread usefulness. The Greek word itself comes from the Greek word for incombustible, and the mineral's fire retardant qualities are among its most valuable characteristic. It was widely used in ships, buildings, theater curtains, and really anywhere fire protection was essential. In addition to having fire retardant properties, it has other unique qualities that make it useful, including its fibrous nature, has a heat stability, thermal and electrical resistance. So it really was found to be a very useful material. You say, well, how widely was asbestos used in the United States? It really was used extensively for many years. And this, especially after World War II, the Navy found that asbestos was an essential component of shipboard fire protection. And then even up until 1976, the building codes in specific areas of buildings where fire protection was essential would call for it. So soon around that time, things started to change. However, in 1973 and then again in 1978, EPA started to prohibit the use of certain spraying of asbestos-containing materials as part of its air pollution regulations. Is asbestos still used in the United States? Well, it's still definitely present in some areas, some buildings, and even in some um, materials like brakes and clutches. It's possible it's still actually possible to purchase building materials containing asbestos. However, it's very important that if you're doing a school or doing a building, you specify non-asbestos containing materials to be used. There's two definitions that are pretty important when it comes to asbestos containing material. There's friable asbestos and there's non-friable asbestos. Friable is certainly considered the more hazardous, and that means the asbestos material, the asbestos containing building material can be crumbled by hand pressure. And of course, what that means is that creates a dust, and the asbestos fibers can become airborne easily. There's also non-friable asbestos containing materials, and these are more building materials that really can't crumble by hand pressure. It's less likely that the fibers are going to get released. Examples are like vinyl floor tile and mastics. So I want to kind of run through just quickly some different types of asbestos materials, asbestos containing materials. There's acoustical sound plaster, acoustical sound tiles. There's blackboard mastic, boiler insulation, brake shoes, ceiling insulation, ceiling tiles and ceiling tile mastic, tank insulation from tanks. The real decorative plaster sometimes contains asbestos. Caulking that goes around doors or windows could contain asbestos. Drywall, and joint compound could contain asbestos. There's duct insulation that could contain asbestos. Electrical insulation could contain asbestos. Exterior building siding, fire blankets, fire curtains, fire doors, fireproofing on beams, flue pipes, if they're insulated, could contain asbestos. Mastic under flooring or under tile, the black mastic could contain asbestos. Pipe gaskets, pipe insulation, roofing such as the felt and the shingles, if it's old enough, it could contain asbestos. Roofing asphalt could also contain asbestos. Thermal tape and expansion cloth or vibration dampeners could contain asbestos. Transite sheets, transite pipes, vinyl asbestos floor tiles, wall and ceiling plasters, window glazing. So again, these were all different types of materials that could, if they're old enough, especially if they're installed before the 1980, they could potentially contain asbestos. And we still see it today in buildings, although it's certainly not as frequent as it was 20, 30 years ago. So why is asbestos of concern? Really, it's because of the health effects and the asbestos diseases that can occur. Asbestos can kill you, of course, if you don't protect yourself. You can't really taste or touch or smell asbestos. The danger is, of course, the fibers that become released. They enter into your lungs and get down into the deep portions of your lungs, or if you ingest asbestos. So inhalation or ingestion of asbestos is really the danger. There's really 4 types of disease that are most commonly talked about. There's white lung or asbestosis. It's a scarring of the lungs, which makes it very difficult to breathe. There's mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a cancer of the lining of the lungs, the lining of the abdomen. It's very, very rare, but if you do get diagnosed, or if there's diagnosis of a mesothelioma, it definitely comes from asbestos exposure. There's also lung cancer, which is the biggest killer of all the asbestos diseases. Asbestos workers who smoke are 80 times more likely to get lung cancer than the general public. So again, if you smoke and you're exposed to asbestos, the chance of getting lung cancer is much higher. And then there's also some other cancers, cancer of the stomach, et cetera, that can result from asbestos exposure. So asbestos, one thing to know, of course, is except for mesothelioma, is dose related. In other words, the more asbestos fibers you breathe or swallow, the more likely you are to have an illness. And that's, of course, referred to as a dose relationship. The exception to this is mesothelioma. There is really no dose related relationship for that disease. One thing that we have found with asbestos is there is a latency period. So it's a time gap between when you are exposed to asbestos, either through an inhalation or swallowing asbestos, or ingestion of asbestos, and when you become sick. And for asbestos diseases, the latency period is typically 10 to 40 years. So if you have employees working with it right now, they're not really going to see any effects until somewhere down the road, 10 to 40 years. So what are the best recommended practices to manage asbestos whether you have employees exposed to it in a task or it's in your buildings? Really, if the asbestos material is in good shape and it's not going to be disturbed, you really don't need to do anything. Do not disturb it. If there is a problem with it, if it's damaged, if it's going to be disturbed by renovation or demolition activities, then you really have two choices. You can repair it or you can remove it. If you do choose to repair or remove asbestos, you have to get in touch with a professional who is trained and certified and licensed to handle the asbestos safely and tell you what to do and make sure the correct action is taken. If if asbestos containing materials are going to be repaired, it usually involves sealing or covering the asbestos material. Sealing, of course, example is encapsulation. It involves treating the material with a sealant that either binds the asbestos fibers together or coats the material so the fibers aren't released. Sometimes pipes, furnaces, boilers are repaired in this way. There's also enclosure. Perhaps you want to this involves placing something over or around the material so that if anything that contains the asbestos is contained inside that enclosure, and there will not be any exposure to the asbestos. Sometimes you'll see insulated piping covered with a protective wrap or a metal jacket. With any type of repair, asbestos remains in place. And although repair is usually less expensive than removal or abatement, somewhere down the road, you still may need to remove it or abate it. And it could be more difficult and more costly at that time. If this type of activity is done, work areas where asbestos repair or remediation is taking place, you have to have segregated areas, containment has to be in place, and you have to take action to prevent any fibers that are released during that activity to keep them out of other areas of the building or away from other employees. Again, trained and certified licensed workers performing the tasks must wear protective clothing, respirators designed for asbestos work. So again, in summary, just what are the best recommended practices? Recognize if you do have asbestos in your building. You need to have enough knowledge to know whether your employees are working with something with asbestos or whether there's asbestos present maybe in your boiler room. Again, you need to have the knowledge to know that it's there. If it's present, you may want to test it to confirm it is asbestos, or you can just assume that the material is asbestos. If it is present, do not disturb it. If the asbestos containing material is damaged or it's going to be disturbed, you need to get a professional involved to choose a corrective action, a response action, which can be, of course, to repair, encapsulate, enclose it, or remove it. And again, any type of work that's done like that, whether it's inspection activity or abatement activity, you want to get certified licensed asbestos personnel involved to help you make the right decisions. So let's jump now from best recommended practices and what asbestos is to OSHA, and what are your OSHA regulatory requirements when you're dealing with asbestos. There's two OSHA standards that come into play. Two standards that we're going to talk about today. The first one is for general industry. This is 29 Code of Federal Regulations 1910.1001, and this is for general industry. It applies to occupational exposures except for construction and shipyard activities. Some definitions that you need to know about asbestos. When you hear the word asbestos with OSHA, it refers to all types, including some of the types we talked about: chrysotile, amosite, crucidolite. And asbestos containing material is any material that contains greater than 1% asbestos. This is an important definition. OSHA has an exposure limit, a permissible exposure limit for asbestos. As an 8-hour time weight average, this is 0.1 fibers per cc. If you have there is also what's called an excursion or a ceiling limit, which is a different type of sample collected over a 30-minute period. And for the excursion limit, you cannot exceed 1.0 fibers per cc. How do you determine whether you exceed permissible exposure limits or not? You do exposure monitoring, and you have to determine through that monitoring what your TWA exposures are. And again, it's through personal air monitoring, where workers actually wear sampling equipment to determine what their exposures are. What is a regulated area? So regulated areas come into play. They are required when airborne exposures exceed the time-weighted average or excursion limit. Regulated areas have to have signage. They have to be posted so that anybody who may potentially go into a regulated area can see that, read the signage that this is a regulated area and it's certain dangers exist. You have to limit access to anybody who is trained and properly protected. And if you have a regulated area, to go into that regulated area, you have to wear proper PPE, including respirators. So under OSHA, there are different methods of compliance that are permitted. First and foremost, you want to try to use engineering and work practices to maintain employee exposures below the TWA excursion limit whenever possible. If you have engineering controls and work practices in place and you still can't get employee exposures below the TWA or excursion limit, then you have to move on to the next step. And that's to supplement those with personal protective equipment, such as respirators, coveralls, Tyvek gloves, things like that. Asbestos is a fibrous material. It can be a powder. So you want to use wet methods whenever you can, whenever it's practicable. You certainly don't want to use compressed air to clean up or remove asbestos unless you can use compressed air in combination with some local exhaust ventilation. Employers where asbestos is present have to, in the workplace, for the general industry standard, have to implement a written compliance plan. If you have exposures that exceed the time-weighted average or excursion limit, and if you're doing brake and clutch repair, you have to utilize HEPA vacuum systems or wet methods to help control employee exposures. Respirators, NIOSH approved respirators must be provided in areas where asbestos are required. They're going to want to wear a respirator with a HEPA filter, HEPA cartridge. If it's a air purifying respirator, and they have to be approved. You have to implement a full respiratory protection program in accordance with another OSHA standard, 1910.134. That's the OSHA respiratory protection standard. There's also protective clothing and equipment requirements. If employee exposures are above the time-weighted average or excursion limit, coveralls, gloves, head coverings, foot coverings, face shield, eye protection, basically whatever is needed to protect those employees is required. And then contaminated work clothing has to be removed in approved change rooms and properly laundered. Hygiene facilities, change rooms are required if you have employee exposures above the TWA or excursion limit. There's also a requirement for shower facilities in that situation if you have employee exposures which are above the TWA and or excursion limit. And you also have to have separate lunchrooms. Employees have to be notified, the hazards related to asbestos have to be communicated to communicated to employees, and that has to be part of your hazard communication program. If you are a building or a facility owner, you need to determine the present locations and quantity of asbestos containing materials at your work site. And, you may need to use some warning labels or signs to tell employees or tell occupants, that asbestos is present. It just depends on the situation, especially like boiler rooms. A lot of times you're going to want to label boiler rooms. Housekeeping, as an employer, you have to keep surfaces as free as practicable of asbestos waste and dust. If there is a spill or a sudden release, maybe, some insulation breaks or something, water leak causes damage to some type of building materials. Spills and sudden releases have to be cleaned up as soon as possible. Of course, if you're doing that cleanup, you have to utilize HEPA vacuums so that the fibers that you capture with cleaning are properly controlled. And again, as we talked about before, you don't want to use compressed air to do cleaning. Medical surveillance is required if you have employee exposures at or above the TWA and or excursion limit. And this includes pre-placement exams, periodic exams, and medical testing. There's also a record-keeping requirement with OSHA. You have to keep employee exposure records like air monitoring results for at least 30 years. And you have to keep employee medical records from any testing that may have done for 30 years. And lastly, there's an observation of monitoring if it's a union or some facility like that, or employees. You must provide employees or their representative the opportunity to observe any air monitoring that's conducted. So that's the basic parts of the general industry standard. So let's jump now into the construction standard. If you remember, general industry did not cover shipyard or did not cover construction activity. The construction activity is covered under its own standard, and it's 29 CFR 1926.1101. And this applies to demolition or salvage of structures, the removal or encapsulation of materials containing asbestos, construction, alteration, repair, maintenance, or renovation of structures, substrates, or portions thereof, installation of products that contain asbestos spill emergency cleanup activities, but it does not apply to asphalt roof coatings, cements, and mastics. So what are some definitions? Some of these are going to be the same, just to hit them real quickly again. Asbestos containing material, any material containing greater than 1% asbestos. With the construction standard for asbestos, they break up the type of work into different classes. There's class 1 asbestos work, which is removal of TSI, which could be asbestos on pipes, fittings, boilers, breaching tanks, and ducts. And they also have surfacing asbestos containing material, and that's asbestos that is sprayed on or trowed on, such as acoustical plaster and fireproofing. If you're doing work with any of these types of materials, this is considered class 1 asbestos work, which it's considered the most hazardous. Class 2 asbestos work is removal of ACM, which is not TSI or surfacing material. And this includes things like wallboards, floor tile, sheeting, roofing, shingles, and construction mastics. Class 3 work for asbestos is repair and maintenance operations. For perhaps you're a facility manager and you're just doing some type of small repair or something, maintenance wise. That falls under class 3. And then class 4 asbestos work is for maintenance and custodial activities during which employees may come into contact with asbestos. Maybe they're cleaning floors or things like that, but they do not actually disturb asbestos containing material. Part of the construction standard requirement is to have a competent person. What is a competent person? Well, there's some key parts of it. First of all, that person has to be able to identify what the asbestos hazards are. They have to be able to select the right controls that are appropriate, and they actually have to have the authority to take corrective action. If you're doing class 1 or class 2 work as above, they actually have to receive a certain EPA training to be considered a competent person. And then a regulated area is an area anywhere where there's class 1, class 2, or class 3 work performed, it becomes a regulated area. Again, there's the OSHA, under this standard, OSHA has a permissible exposure limit. It's 0.1 fibers per cc is an 8-hour time weight average, and also has an excursion limit, which is 1 fiber per cc over a 30-minute period. If you have a multi-employer work site, maybe it's a big construction site, you have to notify other employees on the site of asbestos-related activities, and the general contractor for the site must ensure compliance with the OSHA standard. There's also a requirement for regulated areas, which is a regulated area is required in class 1, 2, or 3 work, or where asbestos airborne exposures exceed the TWA or excursion limit. There's a requirement in regulated areas that they be properly posted to identify where the hazards are, and so that other employees can be notified. And you have to limit access, and of course, in a regulated area, respirators and the proper personal protective equipment is required. There's a requirement to perform an exposure assessment, and that must be conducted by a competent person to evaluate what the employee exposures are. A negative exposure assessment is an assessment where air monitoring is performed and to determine what the employee exposures are. And it's considered a negative exposure assessment if the exposures are actually less than the TWA or excursion limits set forth by OSHA. Periodic monitoring, periodic air monitoring exposure assessment is required if you're doing class 1 and class 2 work. It's actually required daily. If you're doing class other than class 1 or 2, class 3 or 4, you have to do periodic monitoring, and you have to notify employees of the results within 5 working days. So under the OSHA standard for construction, they have certain methods of compliance. These are just some of the highlights of what those methods of compliance are. Keep in mind, you can go to training for this that's like a week long. So this is just kind of a summary of what are the major points in the standard just to make you aware of them. First of all, there's a requirement for engineering and work practice controls. You have to set up, do everything you can to keep the employee exposure as low as you can. Engineering and work practice controls are required. Wet methods, HEPA vacuum, prompt cleanup, disposal of waste and debris is required. You have to maintain a negative pressure containment in the area where they're working with asbestos, maybe doing abatement, and that has to have a minimum of 4 air changes per hour. You have to set up critical barriers over certain parts of like an HVAC system, windows, and then those areas they have to set up what are called critical barriers, and you have to isolate the HVAC systems. The materials inside containment that are just kind of going to be left alone, maybe it's furniture or things like that, they have to be covered with poly or an impermeable drop cloth. So there are some tasks that are actually prohibited with a standard, the use of high-speed disc saws with no HEPA filtration, use of compressed air, dry sweeping or dry cleanup of ACM is all prohibited. And again, there's EPA. You want to look at if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details of everything, it can be found under the EPA model curriculum. And that lists all the requirements for workers, supervisors, inspectors, everything. Of course, if you're working with asbestos in the construction standard, there's a requirement for respiratory protection. The employer must provide an approved respirator, an OSHA approved respirator. Respirators are required. If you're doing class 1 work, they're required, no question. If you're doing class 2 work, you have to wear a respirator as long as, and unless the asbestos containing material can be removed intact, substantially intact. In other words, you're not going to break it into pieces. It's going to remain intact, so there's no release of the fibers. Respirators are required during class 2 and 3 work when wet methods are not utilized, or when a negative exposure assessment has not been completed. They're required in class 3 work when TSI or surfacing ACM or PACM is disturbed. They're required on any occasion where employees are required to be inside a regulated area, perhaps maybe to do custodial duties, or any occasion where employees are exposed above the TWA or excursion limit. You must also implement a respiratory protection program in compliance with 1910.134. There's requirements for protective clothing if you're doing class 1 work, or if employee exposures are above the TWA or excursion limit and you have no negative exposure assessment. You have to wear PPE. What does that include? Coveralls, gloves, head covering, protective clothing. It must be regularly inspected, and contaminated clothing, work clothing, must be removed properly, bagged in impermeable containers, and properly labeled. There's also a requirement if you're doing class 1 work to have hygiene facilities. You have to have a three-stage decon unit attached to the regulated area, and this is a small area where employees come and go. Has an equipment room, has a shower area, and then has a clean change room. And the purpose of this is of the decon is to help employees get from the regulated area out into the clean area without bringing the asbestos with them, without contaminating the clean areas. Also, no smoking is permitted in work areas, of course. As I said before, as with the general industry standard, you have to communicate hazards of asbestos to employees under the construction standard, and it has to be included in your hazard communication program. Building and facility owners must determine the presence, location, and quantity of asbestos at a work site. You have to utilize appropriate warning labels and signs. Under housekeeping, you have to use HEPA vacuums. Asbestos waste debris has to be collected and disposed of in sealed, labeled, and impermeable bag containers. And any asbestos waste and debris has to be properly cleaned up and disposed of in leak-tight containers. If your work falls under the construction standard, there's a medical surveillance requirement. It is required if employees are performing class 1, 2, or 3 work for 30 or more days per year. It's required if employee exposures are above the TWA excursion limit for 30 or more days a year. And it includes a pre-placement exam, periodic exam, and medical testing. You have to maintain employee records of exposure for 30 years, and you have to maintain employee medical records also for 30 years. Under the construction standard, as we said previously, there's a requirement for a competent person, and that's required for each job to ensure worker health and safety, and that competent person is to perform regular and frequent inspections. So that's the end of really what the OSHA construction standard entails. Again, that's kind of a summary of some of the major points of the construction standard. There's other things to it, but for OSHA, the main standards considered are the general industry standard and the construction standard. Now, there's also other regulations for asbestos. I just briefly mentioned those here. The big one, if you have, it's called AHERA, the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act, and this is for asbestos-containing materials in schools. It regulates asbestos in public and private kindergarten through 12th grade schools. It's enforced by the EPA, and it requires inspections to determine the presence of asbestos-containing materials and the development of asbestos management plans. But that applies. The AHERA Act only applies to schools. There's also what's called the NESHAP, which is a national emission standard for hazardous air pollutants. This is basically set up to protect people in the environment. It's enforced by the EPA. If you have where this comes into play, perhaps, is if you're going to demolish a building if the building is older, like before 1980, has a suspect asbestos-containing materials in it, then you have to determine if those materials are present, if there's asbestos in them, by doing an inspection. And then a lot of times those materials may need abated because you can have actually no visible emission of asbestos during the demolition activity. And there's also EPA in Pennsylvania has certain notification requirements where if you're going to do abatement, you actually have to notify the EPA in the state of Pennsylvania that you're going to do this abatement, and you have to give them so many days. For instance, the EPA has like a 10-day notification requirement. So that's a summary of the best recommended practices and the OSHA requirements for asbestos. Just want to briefly mention that, as I said when I started, that we are part of the Pennsylvania OSHA consultation program. We would, if you would like support, if there's any way we can help you, if you would like us to come out and do a visit, a consultation where we come out and go through your work site, try to help you find and fix hazards, go on our website. You can see the address at the top and request a consultation. We'd be happy to help you. Also, don't forget, there's a newsletter that you can sign up for. We also have a very good YouTube channel, Facebook. Feel free to go on there, look at the videos, subscribe, and we'll be happy to continue to provide those for you. And it's a good resource for health and safety information for your employees. So again, I'm Dan Larson. If for any reason you have any questions, you can certainly contact me at any time. There's the office number there. You can also go on the website, ask for information. There's Facebook, Twitter. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Hope this was some useful information for you. And again, anything I can help you with in the future, just feel free to call me, shoot me an email, and we'll be happy to help you protect your employees and help you find and fix hazards. So again, thanks very much. Have a really fantastic day, and we'll see you later.